And there you go. So the kingdom Protista is different than bacteria because they have nuclei. These are fully equipped cells. Some of them are still single cellular, but they have nuclei. That's the main deal. As we look at this kingdom, you're going to get the feeling as we're looking at it that this is the group that systematists. How do you call the people that do taxonomy? Taxonologists, whatever they are. Taxologists. Whatever those people are. That this is the bucket that they put weird things in. They're like, I don't know what this is. This isn't a plant. This isn't a fungus. This isn't an animal. It's not a bacteria. I don't know. It's a protist. And that's kind of what they are. So this is a group of odd fellows is what I'm calling this. Take a moment and write that down. Yes. Yes. Here's my notes. So kingdom Protista, they are all eukaryotes. And remember, this is, the word eukaryotic means true nuclei. And there's some evolutionary bias in that wording because the other possible category is a prokaryote, which means before a nucleus. So be aware of the bias of the word. We do use the word, but it is not, we don't necessarily agree with what that's implying. These are cells that have a real nucleus, but we believe that they are just as old as cells that don't have a nucleus, that God did not create bacteria and then billions of years later say, oh, now let's add a bacteria. I mean, let's add a nucleus, okay? So these are eukaryotic cells. They have a nucleus. They may be unicellular or they may be colonial, but they're not multicellular. So if you see a large thing that is in the kingdom Protista, that thing is not one organism. That thing is a colony of organisms. And so different individuals living next to each other and cooperating and living life together. They're a colony. They may be unicellular though too. There are several protists that are out on their own, and then there's other protists that are stuck together. The reason we say that they're not multicellular is in your body, cells that are stuck together communicate with each other and perform tasks for one another, and together they do all the things that a living thing has to do. For a protist, if you have millions of protistic cells all stuck together, each one is living its own life. They don't do jobs for each other. They don't cooperate on the functions of life. They have everything that they need in their little world, and they happen to have a name. Okay, so that's a colony. Protists may be heterotrophic or autotrophic. So those two words, it means that they might eat something else or they might make their own food. Okay, some protists photosynthesize. Some protists are eat other cells. So that doesn't necessarily describe the group. There are heterotrophs and autotrophs in the group. And then, like I said before, this is usually a categorization by exclusion. If something is not a plant, and it is not an animal, and it is not a bacteria, and it is not a fungus, then we call it a protist. It's the bucket of strange things. Okay? So let me show you some pictures here of different kinds of protists. Oh no, let me do that in a moment after this next slide. There are, generally speaking, three kinds of protists here. Three sorts of animals. Okay. There are protists that are unicellular and are mobile. In other words, they live their own life and they cruise around by themselves. Bacteria are single-cellular, and lots of them are mobile. So protists share that trait with bacteria. Usually they're a much more complicated cell. They have a nucleus as opposed to bacteria. But if they live that sort of life where they're out on their own, cruising around in the world, then we call them protozoa. And again, look at the bias of the word. Proto means early or primitive, right? Early on. And then zoa has to do with animal life. So these are primitive animals, is what that word actually means. These are little creatures that cruise around on their own on the microscopic level and look sort of like they're living an animal's life. So we're going to call them protozoa. But again, I've got to say over and over again, we don't believe that the earliest animals were protozoa. These are protists, and that's the way God made them, and that's what they'll always be. Protozoa, though, are unicellular and mobile. Another category of protists are algae. Every algae is a protist. That's the kingdom that it belongs to. Algae are colonial. They live with either just a couple or sometimes millions of neighbors, all glued together. And when you, walking along the beach, see some seaweed on a rock, that seaweed is not an individual organism as if it were a blade of grass. That seaweed is a colony of protists living next to each other, and they do benefit from one another because of their adhesion. They're stuck to the rock, but they are living their own life with their neighbor. Okay? So colonial, they're autotrophic. They all photosynthesize. No algae eats fish. That would be a strange, like, nightmare movie kind of algae. But algae are all photosynthetic, and they're colonial. And then there are fungus-like protists, protists that behave like fungi. And as a matter of fact, until very recently, this group of creatures was called a fungus. They were in the kingdom fungi. And then some aspects of their cells were analyzed, and it was discovered that they're not actually fungi. So into the bucket of oddfellows they were thrown. And they were like, oh, we used to think you were fungus, but you're not, which means you're a protist. Throw you in there, okay? So there are three categories of protists: the ones that are like little animals, the ones that are like a plant, that are algae, and the ones that are like a fungus, but they're not. Okay, that's kind of the three sorts of creatures in this kingdom. So let's look at those. There are in the creature-like bucket, in the animal-like bucket, in protozoans, there's a couple of different phyla. The phylum Sarcodina is the group of creatures that the amoebas belong to. What do you guys already know about amoebas?
Amoebas.
Single cell. What else do you know about them? They're this weird, like, jelly-ish sort of shape. They have a non-specific cell shape. You can't describe their shape because it's always changing. They move by pseudopodia, and that word means false feet. That's what pseudopodia means. They pour themselves through their environment. So if Alyssa were an amoeba, okay, and if she wanted to go somewhere, she doesn't like take steps. She would pour herself along the floor and would pile up where she wanted to be. I'm sure somewhere there's a superhero that can do that in the Marvel universe. Somebody who can pour themselves through little cracks. There needs to be an amoeba man. Yeah, they will squish their body out in the direction that they want to go, and then they will expand their cell membrane in that area and condense their cell membrane everywhere else, and they wind up pouring themselves into that little poochie pocket that they made. And then pretty soon the little poochie pocket is their cell. And then they'll create another little poochie pocket, and they'll pour themselves into that. So they pour themselves along the ground or along their environment. It's kind of interesting. They are very complicated cellular machines. So anytime somebody tells you that protists are simple, or protists are archaic or rudimentary or down there on the bottom of the evolutionary ladder, they don't understand cellular biology, because the amoeba is actually one of the most complicated cells we've ever discovered. They have some of the most amazing cellular biology, and they are in this single-celled form of life. They are more complicated than any one given cell in your body. So, you know, if we were to say, you know, that amoebas represent the bottom of the evolutionary picture right next to bacteria, well, then why are they more complicated than the thing at the top? As a matter of fact, it's a very commonly used phrase to talk about evolution and say, oh, evolution is from amoeba to man, as if man is really complicated and the amoeba is stupidly simple. But if you look at any one cell from a man and the cell of the amoeba is way more complicated. So it just doesn't work. God designed beautifully on the small scale, just like he designed it beautifully on the large scale. They have these organelles called contractile vacuoles that are pretty cool. You have a whole kidney that filters your blood and makes urine, and you've got a urinary system that gets that out of your body, and that takes organs to do. They've got a little part of their cell that does the same kind of thing, and it absorbs waste products from the cytoplasm, and it stores the waste products, and then every once in a while it squeezes and squirts the waste products out the cell. So, you know, you've got a whole bunch of cells that do that. It's got a little itsy-bitsy part of itself that functions like a kidney and a urinary system. The contractile vacuole is pretty awesome. And then it eats. You have a mouth, and you stick things in your mouth like Andrea is about to do with that Pop-Tart. And you've got a whole bunch of machinery that goes into breaking that food down and making it useful for the cells of your body. They will pour themselves around the food molecule, and the food molecule finds itself surrounded by an amoeba. And then the amoeba will digest the thing that it just poured itself around. Imagine if you ate that way. You set the Pop-Tart on your desk, and Andrea is like, I want to eat that. And so she like dissolves her body and runs it around the desk, and then there's this ball of Andrea around the Pop-Tart. And then all of a sudden the Pop-Tart starts to dissolve and go inside her. Like, that's kind of what amoebas do. They're amazing. That process is called phagocytosis. Phago means to eat. We talked about last week a phagocyte in your body is a cell that eats bacteria. Phago means to eat. Cytosis means the cell is doing it, right? So just like a phagocyte is a cell that eats, phagocytosis is the process of a cell eating. And that's what an amoeba does. Do I have pictures yet? Good, yes. Here's an amoeba, and this is why I say that amoebas don't have a particular shape. What shape is that? Yeah, that's that thing. That looks like somebody sneezed.
Looks like a whale. Hey!
Okay. And you can see here, it's in the process of phagocytosis. It wants to eat this little booger, whatever this is. It wants to eat that. So it is pouring itself around that thing. And when it surrounds the thing, then it'll totally envelop it, and then it'll start to digest that little bit of thing, okay? It does have a true nucleus. As a matter of fact, some amoeba have multiple nuclei. These dark spots could all be nuclei. Sometimes they have multiple nuclei, not just one. And then the contractile vacuole is this thing right here, and it is absorbing waste products from the digestion of material in the amoeba, and every once in a while it's going to just go and squeeze all that stuff out. Okay? So, very complicated cell. Praise the Lord for the amoeba. It is a work of his hands. It's gorgeous. Here's a picture of an amoeba moving. And it is kind of exploring its environment. So you can see that it's leaving this area, and it's going in this direction. And so it's pouring itself. And you can see some of it is getting poured into here, and then it's like, no, I don't want to go that way. And it starts to pour itself back down. I think it's going to wind up going this way. But amoebas sometimes explore multiple directions at one time, and then we'll say, oh, just kidding, not there. I'm going to go over here. And so this motion is very complicated. And you can watch this thing do its stuff. Amazing cell. And look at all the machinery that's in here. There's tons and tons of stuff in an amoeba cell, all doing its job. So a very complicated cell. Okay, take a moment to write that down. Okay, the another group in the protozoans, the individual cells living on their own, running around in their environment, sort of protist, is the Coleophora phylum. Coleophora, cilia are little hair-like structures that cover these creatures, and so they're covered with cilia. Their name is Coleophora. And they use these for locomotion. They're like little, it's like body hair, right? You have body hair, I have body hair. Some of us shave various parts of it because we don't want body hair there, but you're covered with hair. And the Paramecium are covered with hair too. But the cool thing that they can do with their hair that you can't do with yours is they can beat their hair and use that to swim. Could you imagine if you go diving in the pool and you jump in the pool or jump in the ocean, and then you don't have to do this, you don't have to do this to swim, right? You just sit there and all of your hair go. And you move through the water. That would be really cool. That's what a Paramecium does. So when a Paramecium swims, you don't see large body motion like you do with the amoeba that is pouring itself through its environment. The cell looks like it's just kind of, I don't know, like a little sausage. And it is swimming all over the place. You're like, how is it swimming? That is the coolest thing. And it's swimming by all these little hair that it's beating in a rhythmic motion to make themselves swim. They have a mouth that's always open. I feel like a Paramecium sometimes. And that opening is always open. It's called a gullet. Okay. The opening is called the oral groove, and the little pocket behind it is called the gullet. And they're always swimming around, and whatever little bit of food particle or small bacteria or something that happens to fall into the gullet as it's swimming by gets digested. So it's an indiscriminate eater. It will just eat whatever falls into its mouth. Okay. So again, walking around with your mouth open all the time and going through a buffet and just be like, right? And whatever happens to fall in your mouth, you eat. And that sounds like a great plan. So that's the gullet. And it channels food particles into the cell, and then it digests whatever lands in there. These are the biggest of the protozoa. As a matter of fact, these guys can be seen with the naked eye. If you've got good vision, you can look into pond water and see the little Paramecium swimming around. So they're single cellular, but they're big enough that you don't need a microscope to at least see that there is something there. You'll use a microscope to study their structure, but they're big enough to be seen by the naked eye. And they can exchange genetic information through conjugation. So when animals sexually recombine their genes, the parents stay themselves, and the baby is a mixture of mom and dad. These guys, parent, get together, but they exchange DNA with each other, and when they leave, they are different than when they got together. And then they will divide through regular binary fission and mitosis and wind up with having, babies of themselves. But they leave different. So it's not really sexual recombination, because sex is mom and dad get together and they are still mom and dad. They're not like part mom and part dad when they're done, right? And the baby is a mixture of mom and dad, not half of dad's body. So it's not the same thing. It's not the same thing, but they are mixing DNA. They're exchanging DNA, and that's called conjugation. So this is a picture of a Paramecium, and you can see all the hair all over them. Those little hairs are called cilia. It looks like a kiwi, sure. And then if you look at them with a light microscope, so you're seeing through them, you can see the little bit of hair on the edge. But again, very complicated cellular biology going on here. And as they swim around, let me get my picture out of the way. This is that oral groove, the mouth that's always open. And this is the gullet where things land. So he's swimming along, and if some little bit of something bumps into him here and he swims past it, it's just going to get channeled into the gullet, and he'll happen to eat whatever lands in there. Okay? They still have a contractile vacuole, and like the amoebas did, very, very complicated cells, and big enough to be seen by the naked eye. Here's a pair of parameciums in conjugation, and so they are exchanging DNA right now, and so part of the DNA of this organism is going to wind up in this organism, and it will exchange the same segment of DNA with this one. So when they're done and they leave, they are no longer the way that they were. They have become a different individual. Their DNA is different. Okay, and here's just a little animation of the cilia swimming back and forth, and that rhythmic beating of hair is what moves the thing through the water.
It's like what Nemo lived in.
It's like what? What Nemo lived in? Oh, no, he lived in a sea anemone, which is a much bigger. Alrighty. There you go. Sporozoa. You know, for the sake of time, I'm going to talk while you write. Sporozoans, phylum Sporozoa, they are commonly called plasmodiums, or Plasmodia is the most common individual of this group. These are all parasites, okay? So the phylum Sporozoa are all parasites. They're called Sporozoa because they form spores. A spore is sort of like an egg, but don't confuse it. An egg is an individual makes eggs, and then those eggs are dormant for a while and then turn into another individual. A spore is the individual turns itself into an egg, kind of. It doesn't produce massive numbers of these things. It forms a spore out of itself, and the spore is like a dormant stage of this creature. And the spore can survive out in the world until the creature finds itself as a parasite in another individual. So it leaves the parasitic body or the body of the host that it was a parasite in, and it says, hey, I'm no longer in an animal that I'm a parasite on. So it turns into this hard little spore that can survive out in the world until it gets back into a body of another host, and then it's like, okay, I can leave the spore stage and go back into, you know, a normal adult creature. And so the spore is basically a nucleus surrounded by a little bit of cytoplasm, not much, and a very thick cell wall. And so the cell wall protects the genetic information, and as soon as that gets back into a host, then it will turn back into the recognizable sporozoan parasite. They don't have cilia, they don't have flagella, and they are usually spread by vector organisms, a mosquito, a flea, something of that nature that bites an animal, and while it's having its blood meal, gets these creatures in it, and then goes and bites somebody else, and a little bit of backwash, and the sporozoan spreads. So these are all parasites, and they survive from host to host as a spore. Okay? You don't want these things. These are not fun. Here's a picture of malaria.
Oh.
These are normal red blood cells. These are red blood cells infected with a parasite, with a sporozoan parasite. The black things are the sporozoans, okay? And the sporozoans are multiplying within this infected red blood cell. And the red blood cell doesn't become blue, but they have stained the waste product of the sporozoan blue so that the cells that have the sporozoan in it show up as blue. But you can see that these are infected red blood cells, and this person has malaria. Malaria is a sporozoan that's spread by mosquitoes. Okay? And this is your last one for today. Phylum Zomastagina. That's a fun word to say.
Wait.
Zomastagina. Zo means animal, okay? Masty has to do with to whip, okay? And so these are animals that whip it, okay? Watch me whip it. And that's because they have these long things called flagella sticking out of the back of them. And the flagella are like propellers. If the cilia are like oars in a boat, sticking out of the side going like this, a flagella is like a propeller. It's a big thing that comes out of the back of the boat. It spins around in a circle that drives it forward. Okay? So zomastoginans, they're also called zooflagellates, same idea. Little animals with tails, okay? Little animals with whips. And they are propelled by these flagella. They feed by phagocytosis, so just like the amoeba surrounded its prey with its body and then digested it, these zomastoginans do the same thing, okay? And they are found in freshwater sources. Lots of them cause disease. Trypanosomiasis is the African sleeping sickness, a disease that causes a high fever and the person's kind of black out, and it looks like they're sleeping, but they're in a fever-induced coma, essentially, and then it's frequently fatal. So trypanosomiasis is an example of this. Cryptosporidiosis, starting over, Cryptosporidiosis, there you go, is found in our water, Hawaii water. This is one of the reasons that you don't just drink running water, okay? And the chemistry group that did that for their science fair project, maybe you read that board back at the science fair, but they were able to find bacteria in every water source that they tested. So don't go drink Hawaii's surface water for many reasons. One of them is this cryptosporidiosis. So these are single-cell flagellated, often disease-causing protists. And I have a couple of pictures of them, and then we'll call it good for this today. So again, these are not bacteria. There are flagellated single-celled bacteria. But if you look at a bacteria, it's very small and it's very simple. The protists are not simple. Very complicated cells. They've got a lot going on. These cells will eat by phagocytosis, but lots of them are also photosynthetic. So you can see this one has chloroplasts and will photosynthesize, but it will also eat. So it's kind of plant-like in that it can get food from the sun, and it's kind of animal-like in that it will chase you down and eat your butt. And so it's going to, it's got a lot of different complicated cell machinery going on there. And you can see the long tail sticking out. This is a flagella, and it spins around rapidly and drives the animal forward. And again, another opportunity to worship God for his design. The structure of the flagellum is incredibly complicated. If you look at the parts of what it takes to have a rotary motor, a DC motor, all of the parts of a DC motor are represented in the parts of the flagellum. And so it took humanity thousands of years to get advanced to the point where we can design DC motors. But God had that going on from day one. So pretty awesome. Pretty awesome. Here is a picture of somebody infected with African sleeping sickness. These are red blood cells, and these are protists swimming around through their blood, eating red blood cells and causing all kinds of havoc. So again, you can see the tails sticking out. These are flagella. These are very large. The last picture of a disease in a red blood cell, there were several individuals of the parasite inside one red blood cell. This is a red blood cell. This is an individual parasite. These are huge cells swimming around, causing havoc in the person, and in all likelihood, eventually killing them. Okay, and this is the 2 stages of the Cryptosporidiosis that you can find in our drinking water, not our drinking water, our surface water. If you go stick your mouth in a river, you might get this. When he's not being a parasite, it looks like this. This is the spore. Okay, it's got several nuclei wrapped up in a lot of protein to keep it safe. And then you drink it, and it goes, ooh, I'm in a belly. And it turns, this protein gets broken down, and all these nuclei become individuals, and they swim around, and this is what it looks like in your gut, making you an unhappy camper. Okay? Very fun. This is what Cryptosporidiosis looks like in your gut. So these are your intestine cells, and this would be the center of your intestine where your food goes by, and you can see these parasites on the surface that are burrowing down in, and these cells that have the dark staining in them is not just that they have more DNA. These cells with the dark staining in them is being affected by Cryptosporidiosis. So this is an infected lining of your intestine. Not a good time. Here's a scanning electron micrograph of the Cryptosporidiosis cells burrowing themselves into your intestine. And so they're drilling down into your intestine, getting down in here to feed on your cells and make you an unhappy person. We are going to look at algal protists next week, but just until we get to them, they're my favorite group of protists. I just want to show you just kind of the scale, because the single cell protists, the protozoans that we were looking at today, are all very small. These kelp pictured behind the diver, this is also protists. This giant kelp, which can be hundreds and hundreds of feet tall, are all single-celled brown algal protists living glued to their neighbor. And it looks like a plant, but it's not. It's all a colony of protists. So just to see the scale of this kingdom, it's very, very different. Okay? There you go. God bless you. I will see you tomorrow. We'll go over